calling all Clojure beginners. The Clouncil is a fun and friendly live call-in show for people starting off on their journey with Clojure to ask experienced Clojurians questions and work out problems together. Why do we do this? Well, we want to help you get unstuck. Are you baffled, befuddled, flustered, flummoxed? Having trouble telling your left parentheses from your right? Your conj from your cons? Well, every other Wednesday, we are here to help you out. Who's here to help you out? The Clouncil core team consists of 5 developers. Myself, Jordan Miller, aka Lambda, as a Chief Lambda Officer. Friend Paula Giron, the Graph Whisperer. Another friend, Mike Fikes, who's known to be a self-hosted compiler. Arne Bressor, head of transducing, and of course, our captain of this ship and inspiration for this project, Daniel Higginbotham. If you follow the QR code on the screen, or you just navigate to theclouncil.com, you too can give us a question to answer and work through. We will also have a myriad of guests and surprise people joining us. Can't wait to see you there.
Welcome to the Clouncil, a call-in show for newbies and novices on the path to being Clojure pros. Send us your problems, tell us what has you confused or perplexed, and we will try to respond with thoughtfulness and hopefully kindness. I'm Paula, the compere for this edition of the game show. Please, being somewhat less loquacious and more laconic, I'll try to be terse, much like our favorite language. So today we have Arne Bressor, the prime mover behind Lambda Island. We also have Daniel Higginbotham, the author of the immensely popular Clojure for the Brave and True, and Jordan Miller, meme creator extraordinaire and host of the immensely popular podcast Lost in Lambda. Unfortunately, we are missing the indubitable Mike Fikes, but we will try to do our best in his absence. So this week we are having our early summer edition, but I'm going to remove my sunglasses.
We tried.
And use something a little more appropriate for reading the questions that we have. The first which we're going to look at for this week comes from MikeNardell. It's a somewhat long question, so I'm just going to read it out and ask our various hosts to respond. This question sort of piggybacks on a question I had back in March. One of my challenges in working with Clojure is that I still get a bit twitchy whenever I need to add a new library to the requires clause of the NS expression. First, I wonder if I will get syntax and naming correct. I have noticed that the GitHub documentation often expresses the requires as you would call it from the REPL, and still need to think through how to rewrite an NS expression in my CLJ file. And then I fumble around as I try to get the external library to get loaded correctly into my working repo. I only recently figured out Sussman Insider. I have not fully grokked how to refresh dependencies in Calva VS Code, which I have just started playing with. So there's lots going on here. I think part of my deficiency is not having a good working mental model of Java, Maven, etc. And things are probably worse when we get into the JavaScript world. Okay, so lots happening here. I think the first thing to look at would be the basics, I think, around loading, like requiring namespaces in the NS declaration. So Arne, since I introduced you first, would you like to have a comment here?
Certainly. Let's actually first see, because I believe Michael is here. Michael, do you want to add anything to that question or elaborate a little bit of where this is exactly coming from?
Yeah, I guess it's just one of those friction points. I'm sort of going along happily, getting stuff working, functions going, and then I realize, oh, I got to load a dependency, and I just get sad at that point. And because it's sort of, you know, mostly because I still get a little confused about, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that the, you know, essentially the libraries are loaded into my class path, making sure that's happened correctly. What do I need, what do I need to do? You know, and then, you know, then there's a whole issue of like, is this library going to work or whatever, but just taking away that concern, there's that hesitation of, and I want to get more comfortable with that step so that I can just keep going as smoothly as possible. So any advice to just sort of be okay, to learn to love to load dependencies, or I mean, or I guess maybe there's that point of view, which is like dependencies are always you know, something to be avoided, and you know, maybe that pain is a little bit of a good thing. I don't know.
Yeah, thanks for elaborating. So in that case, I would actually suggest that yeah, we take it from the top, sort of like, okay, you know, like, so you have a project, right? And at some point you realize that, oh, there's this third-party dependency, you know, some library that's not bundled with Clojure, and I wanna use something from that, right? And so I'm gonna use one of our own libraries, Lambda Island URI, just a simple small utility library, and there's a lot of tools that or I don't know, there are definitely tools that like make this easier, how to do this sort of in a smart way, add libraries for you and reload and so forth. I've used some of them in the past. I'm a bit of a caveman. I'm just going to show you like basically the manual way, which always works. So what we always do in our READMEs is put these coordinates. And so these are like, the syntax differs a little bit between deps and project CLJ. So this is what you would use for lining, and this is what Clojure CLI uses. But in the end, it's the same thing, right? It's like, it's a Maven group ID, a Maven artifact name, and then you need your Maven version. So Clojure, for its dependency management, piggybacks on a Java system for dependency management called Maven, and so that's why you see all that MVN and stuff in there. So I'm just going to copy this here because I'm using deps Eden. Now, if it's not, you know, immediately in the README like this, you know, you can just find a version, but like, usually there's also a link to Clojures, or you can Google the project with like, you know, just add Clojures to your Google query. And then you get to this page. And here you actually find the same coordinates in even more variants. Gradle and Maven are Java build tools, which some people also use for Clojure projects. Or you might be using a Clojure library in a Java project. That's also possible. But so yeah, we mainly care about the ones at the top here. So again, you know, you take the one you need for the tool you're using, copy that. And then here, I got my little Clouncil demo project. I'm gonna go to the deps Eden. Deps Eden can just be, you know, like an empty map, and you can take it from there. In this case, I populated it again with basically the default values. So if you don't put anything in there, or you put this in there, comes down to the same thing. Clojure CLI will give you the latest version of Clojure by default. And so yeah, there's this deps mets here, there's paths, which is where like normally you put your source code on your local project, and there's deps where you put your dependencies. So I've just put that in here. And now I have a REPL, but I can't load this yet because it could not locate Lambda Island URI on the class path. And so that's the first time we encountered that word class path. That's another Java concept. It basically means it's basically a sequence of directories and potentially jar files. And when Java tries to find a file, it's going to scan all these different places until it finds a file with that name. So now that I've added this.
Well, I just want to mention, like, so jar files, if you're not aware, they're really, aren't they basically tar files? Like, right?
They're zip files.
Zip files.
Yeah.
And just like, so within that, if it's looking on a class path within the jar file, within that jar file, you can have directories and subdirectories and whatnot, and like files within that. And so that when you add like a jar to your class path, and Java is trying to search that class path, it will search those files within that jar and within those directories.
Is there any way to inspect the class paths and from the comfort of the REPL? Is that it just seems like
yes, but it's not like there's a few caveats. Now what you can do, so let me check here. I think it's spath. Yeah, spath. So the easiest way, basically, like if you're in your project here where you have your deps hidden, when you say clj dash capital letter S path, then it's gonna print out the class path, and it's actually here, let me do this in Tmux so I can scroll. And now you see that it's put a whole bunch of stuff in there. So it's basically like it's things separated by colons. And some of these are directories. So source, for instance, is in here because I put that in my path in my deps hidden. This one is in here because I have this in my Clojure deps hidden. So there's this. You can put a Clojure deps hidden on your file system, and then this is basically all like extra stuff that you get by default. And so there's a couple things that I basically always load, and this is actually a tool that is specifically meant to help people inspect Classpath. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but yeah, if you want to do it like in the REPL, there's a lot of nuance to it. I've written a couple blog posts. This stuff goes very deep. I don't want to get that deep. Conceptually, you can stick with this as like what most of the time this is like an accurate model of what the class path is. So it's these directories, and then some of these, if you go a little bit further, okay, here now you see home arna.m2, which is your Maven repository where these Maven files that it downloaded with this Maven version manager. Where these end up. And so over here, if I put this aside, it says URI version.jar. And so, yeah, that is, as Daniel pointed out, it's a standard archive file. So that's what's in there. So now when I go back here, and I'm getting a little bit already, off track, but I hope this paints a picture. So now, point is that at this point, I need to restart my REPL for this to be picked up. So if you make any changes in here, in your deps hidden or in your project CLJ, you need to restart your REPL. Again, there are tools that try to prevent this. And actually, in this Lambda Island Classpath library, there's something that will watch your deps hidden for changes and automatically load them into your running process. So you can try that stuff out if you really want to further optimize this. It's most interesting in the beginning of a project where you're like quickly adding more libraries and trying stuff out, and you don't want to restart all the time. So yeah, that was step one of just like adding the dependency, and now I can go here and require it into my namespace. Are there any questions about the stuff so far?
For me, no. This is great. I mean, this really helps. This is sort of reinforcing what I kind of know, but making sure I haven't been doing it wrong. It's kind of nice to see that it's like, okay, yeah, it's not, it's not too bad, but it's not. There's not something easier I'm missing too. It's
Yeah, like I said, like tools exist to make this easier. But yeah, most of the time, especially when you're working on like a little bit of a mature project, you're not even doing this every day. So like having to just like quickly restart your REPL and go on from there, I personally don't find it enough of a big deal to sort of figure out the extra tooling around it. But sometimes it's cool to have. So maybe another Clouncillor wants to like take it from here, and I can sort of like, you know, try to follow in the REPL, sort of, you know, like the difference between require versus require, and then all the stuff that can go in here. You know, we have like s and refer, and anyone wants to, because I've been blabbering a lot already.
Yeah. Oh.
Oh, no, only thing I have to add is I just keep thinking of Michael saying learning to love to load libraries. I'm like, that's just sounds great. Just the learning to love to load libraries segment.
If anyone wants to contradict what I've been saying, maybe you have a different feeling about, you know, adding libraries to your project, or you love it, you hate it, you have a very different way to do it.
Well, I think that Michael had brought up something interesting a little bit earlier when he said that, you know, is it hard on purpose to discourage me from doing it?
Like, yeah, I did like that too. Yeah.
You know, yeah, I think that, you know, just to touch on that a little bit, there is, you know, do you need 5 different time manipulation libraries? No, you should probably just pick one of them and not like, you know, just do the little bit of research beforehand to find out which library is going to like suit your needs. And if you really need one, that's fine. But yeah, it's not particularly hard, but hard enough that, yeah, a little bit of a pain in the butt, just to make it, just to remind you what you're doing. You're adding a whole new code base with all of its bugs and all of its responsibilities and all of its, you know, you are linking the code that you're creating to code that somebody else created. And with that comes kind of great responsibility. So it's good to be cognizant of it. So I kind of like that you have to, you know, reload, reconnect your REPL. That's probably a good thing in my eyes.
Yeah, and actually on that note, so like, cause yeah, I'd almost forgotten that I had this stuff here, right? Like these extra dependencies that I'm basically loading like every single time I start a REPL. I mean, they're there for a reason. I do use them sometimes, but like if I take them out, suddenly our class path is, you know, is much more manageable, right? Like now we actually can understand everything that's in here. Like this is the URI library we added. It doesn't have any other dependencies. Then there's Clojure itself. And then there's Clojure spec alpha, which since a couple of versions is a dependency of Clojure itself. And then, well, no, this is actually spec alpha, the last one here. And then the one in the middle here are the specs for Clojure. So when, for instance, I go back here and I say, you know, so this is supposed to be a keyword, Lambda Island URI, but I use a symbol, then that's going to cause a spec error. Here you can see like spec set this call to Clojure namespace did not conform to the spec for it, and so those specs are in this jar. But so suddenly there's a lot less stuff here, right? Whereas before, even though there's only like 2 more projects, right? Like here, like there's like Lambda Island Classpath and scope capture that I'm adding, but actually I'm adding like dozens of extra jars. Here, look at this. Because, you know, these libraries depend on other libraries, which depend on other libraries. And so you can see that too with S3. You can sort of see the tree of dependencies. Yeah, so now it's just this. And so, yeah, like it is, as Jordan said, it is super important to be a little bit cognizant of this, you know, like if you're willy-nilly pulling in all kinds of stuff, yeah, you're going to regret that later on, basically.
And did we cover, because you can just load it directly into your REPL from the project if you just want to send into your REPL require, if I guess we haven't gotten to using it at the namespace level yet. Okay, never mind.
Yeah. So yeah, continue. So yeah, you can actually in your REPL require it like this, right?
Yeah, Paula was going to say something.
It was more relevant to the what's in the class path, and that is that while Arne showed the way to print the class path when you're using the CLI tools, when you're actually at your REPL, you can always execute the command system/get property for Java Classpath.
Right.
Oh, no, there's a dot between class and path.
There might be. If you say it like that, there probably is. Yeah, there it is.
So that
Yeah,
shows
so that's
what you're
very-
dynamically using at that moment in time.
Well, yeah, although this is
It
this
can be
property-
edited and modified at runtime, but this is what you start with.
Yeah, exactly. This is what the JVM started with. So there are tools that do all kinds of funky stuff with the Classpath and the class loader. Again, this is already pretty advanced stuff. I wrote some blog posts about this if you want to get into that. This property gets set when the JVM starts. And it can, like, I can change this property. And that's not gonna actually change what the JVM sees. And vice versa. You can does that work? No. And vice versa, like the what the JVM actually scans and what you see in this property can diverge as well. But yes, this is actually a good like surface level check of like, okay, you know, like what's my class path that I started with.
Yeah. What? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was just going back to the CLJ S path option. That seems really nice because that shows you the class path that's essentially pulled in that particular, the context of that particular essentially deps Eden. Is that, do I have that right? Because that seems like you showed that and I was like, well, that's a lot more useful to me than just looking at the Java class path. That tells me what's the class path relevant in this particular context, if I have that straight. Or maybe I didn't get that right.
Well, yeah, no, I think your reasoning is sound, but like in the end, they shouldn't differ. Like Clojure, what Clojure CLI really does is start Java with a certain class path and certain main arguments. And that's actually also something you can see it do. So like CLJ is really just or Clojure is just a bash script. And if you pass -x to bash, you can see what it's doing. And then you actually see that, like, you know, what it's actually doing is calling exec Java, setting a couple things, and then just passing on this whole class path. And then saying, okay, and then start Clojure main. Right. And so this class path is the same class path you're going to see with CLJS path, is the same class path you're going to see with system get property Java class path. Does that help?
Yeah. but I mean, I could see it's nice though with that. If I got it right with, you know, you showed that when you removed a dependency from your deps.eden, and
yeah,
you essentially truncated it reduced it to just the class path that's relevant in that particular context, which is just nice to just see that. Or maybe
no, absolutely, I agree. Like that's and also, like, so I have, for instance, a bunch of aliases here. Let me take these out again. But like, for instance, I could say, like, okay, you know, like, say I have this new alias. Okay, well, what does the class path look like when I have this new alias being active? And now you see that it actually needs to download those dependencies, and now I have a different class path, right? So you can, like, sort of see what your aliases do.
So I mean, I have to say this is just great. Just seeing that how much stuff is packed into CLJS tools, like it's kind of like I know nothing about those set of tools. I really haven't looked at this. So just knowing that there's some really nice stuff there that I need to look into is great.
Mm-hmm.
That's good to hear. Yeah,
that's very good. Yeah,
I think one thing I kind of want to try to talk about, just taking a step back, is I think that one of the reasons why like Line Again and Deps Eden and CLJ and whatnot are kind of why those feel like they have so much friction when, especially when you're first coming to it. Like I remember when I came to Clojure, like I tried to just get stuff working, and then like all the rest of it, it just felt like too vast, you know, and I didn't know where to begin to even try to understand it. But so my understanding of it now is basically like Clojure being a hosted language. Usually when we're writing, well, often when we're writing Clojure, we're writing like JVM Clojure. And then so I think part of why this stuff feels maybe confusing, or like there's that friction there, is that it's not really clear like where the boundaries are between the Clojure language and the host, you know, the JVM platform, right? And so like there are some like nice tools and like line again Clojure, like the CLJ command line tool, to make it a little bit easier to work with that like that intersection point, right? But those tools also, I think they also assume some kind of some degree of knowledge about what's happening underneath, right? But the main thing that's happening underneath is really like you're trying to start a JVM, you know, and this JVM is going to include Clojure as one of its libraries, right? And then on top of that, it's going to include whatever other libraries you need for your application. So to specify those other libraries, this being like, you know, in the Java world, you have to specify them in a way that, well, I guess I wouldn't say you have to specify them, but we specify them in a way that works with the kind of Java artifact ecosystem, right? So when people want to share their Java libraries, they share them either to Clojures, or there's also, I think, the Maven Central repo. And so there, like Java has a kind of canonical way of identifying libraries. And that is what Arna covered earlier with a kind of group ID and artifact ID, and then also version number, right? So, so Clojure, which is built on top of Java, also adopts that kind of artifact identification scheme, and then uses that to build this class path that the JVM can use to actually then load these so that you can use them. So I think we kind of like have gone through all of that, but I kind of want to tie it together and just explain like this is really one of the main intersection points where you like, for the most part when you're writing Clojure code, you really don't have to think about Java like that much, right? Especially when you're just starting out. But at this point in particular, those details are, I don't think that we do too much to try to abstract over those details. And so it's helpful to understand them. I don't know, is that,
sorry?
Well, I was gonna ask if that was helpful to Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of just kind of the point I'm at in my Clojure learning point, is sort of learning to love the JVM again. I mean, actually, you know, I'm definitely one of those people who, you know, my first experience with JVM, yeah, I like the idea of targeting the JVM, and it's just that I've been so far removed from Java that there's this relearning process of like learning to, like relearning an old city you used to know. It's like, things have changed and I don't even remember how to get around. I don't know the bus system anymore. That's kind of where I'm at with Java. So it's like relearning that old city that I've forgotten about.
I'd like to get to Jordan, who never got her opportunity to talk earlier. And I suspect that the one thing something she may be getting onto is the one element of this that we haven't really gotten to yet, and we'll have to move on to the next question soon. And that is that after setting up the class path, we still need to do a require, maybe a use. I don't like those, and even in import. That hasn't been discussed at all.
Yeah, so this is just, you know, a lot of what we talked about was kind of like the abstraction that's going on underneath. And I'll even say that I've gotten to this point in my Clojure career where, you know, some of that stuff I didn't necessarily know or you know, use commonly. So that's, but this kind of stuff, you know, when you put anything from Clojures into your deps Eden or project CLJ, you want to use it right in a namespace. So it looks like Arna is in the namespace and you require it. Using the syntax, a super helpful tool that I recommend is a CLJ condo, because something that it will do is tell you if you are, it kind of helps you out if you're, because you don't want to require packages that you're not using. And, you know, vice versa, if you use something it's not required at the top, then you're going to run into problems. So here we see that Arna is requiring a Clojure.string as str. Actually, in the Clojure docs, it even says that even though Clojure string is a built-in, they do not recommend. You could hypothetically call it in line by doing like Clojure.string /, join, whatever. But they recommend instead use require with as to specify a prefix. There are some common prefixes such as s or str. Str is what I see used a lot, and that's what Arna is using here. And so what we think is important to get into. So the way that he's required it here, he's in requiring the library as string. So anytime he wants to use anything from the library, as long as he prefixes it with str /, any of the utils from that library can be used, which is pretty cool. And it also is helpful. This is what I use for most things I use from libraries, because then when you read it, you're not wondering, okay, where is this function coming from? What is this? How is this? You see str, you're like, oh, I know that's Clojure.string. I don't have to scroll all the way up and see where I got it from, scroll all the way down. Now there are certain things like he's writing out right now, Clojure.test, where refer is the other thing that you would use. Now, refer you want to use when it's super common. You're using it. This is, I'll preface this with, this is in my opinion, in my experience, and then talking with other senior engineers, I've even asked like, okay, what is the line for when you use refer? And the other Clouncillors may be able to elaborate on that. But, def test is always going to come from Clojure.test. We use it so many times that prefacing def test with, say we had imported Clojure.test as test on every single line, doing Clojure.test / def test. That gets to be too much. We're using def test, if you're writing tests on every line. And the other thing is, I know in Reframe, there's a couple of, if you're using a library that uses things like dispatch and subscribe, that's another thing that like you just use refer, because every time you see subscribe or dispatch, like, every time you see def test, what that's referring to. It's not going to be confusing for anybody reading the code. You can also use them in conjunction. If you want to do the way he was scrolling up before, you can use them. You can do Clojure.test as T, and then, if there's a couple of things that you're using commonly, you can combine them like this. That is the other. So I will, I've been talking for a while, so I will let anybody, well, first I'll ask Michael whether this made sense, and then I'll let the other Clouncillors speak to, kind of what their lines are when they use as versus refer, and like when it's appropriate. So Michael, what are your thoughts?
All really great. Yeah, no, this is really helpful to see this sort of laid out. I mean, I've sort of pieced this together, but I think this is, a lot of what's been, it just really helps reinforce what I know, the way this has been presented. So I'm very happy.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
I might wrap this question up then. I'll add in a single extra comment for myself, which is that when we were doing those requires, or even an import, imports are slightly different, but when we're doing the require, it's making use of the Java packaging arrangement. So whenever we see require, and then there's there'll be a path of like lambda island dot URI or Clojure dot string. We can have these paths which are dot separated. Every element of those paths up to the final element will actually represent a directory that we find in the class path. The final element there will always represent a namespace file, which is found in the appropriate directory. As Anna is writing, it's a CLJ or CLJC, or if we're in another platform, it could be CLJS. And there are some which will be longer, for instance, clojure.java.io, that refers to the Clojure/Java directory, and inside of that is io.clj.
One teeny little thing, little thing to add to this question. If Arda could show in the REPL, if say you just want to like try something out, like, oh yeah, let me see if this let me see if join is the right thing to use, or let me see if you could bring up your REPL, Arna. You can do require directly in your REPL, except you do need to use that little tick mark. The syntax is slightly different, and that's all I wanted to mention. Is and a lot of times I'll be doing this like when I'm debugging in my REPL and I'm using the REPL to do and instead of my mouse, instead of clicking around the app, I'm trying to like hit a button or like, operate, debug and do things, just like keeping it all in my IDE. And so I'll do like a comment block, and I'll use that require. I'll use that a lot, require directly from the REPL in those instances where I'm just trying, like, I know that, okay, yeah, I only need Clojure walk for what I'm doing, which is cheating, which is clicking buttons with my keyboard in the IDE. So yeah, I just wanted to show this because it really confused me for a long time. That little tick mark, that little literal there, that is, you will forget to put that in and then not know. So that's all I wanted to say.
And this is because require is a function and not a macro. And so it, when the evaluator sees it, it's going to think that Clojure walk is a symbol and try to figure out what's that symbol mean, but there is none.
Yeah.
Quoting
Thanks
it,
so much for that point.
Structure and works with that.
Thank you. I've always sort of like, oh yeah, I need to put a tick mark, but I never really fully carried through like, oh yeah, why is that? So that makes a ton of sense. That's
yeah, it's a function which is receiving parameters. You haven't declared what Clojure walk is there, so it doesn't know how to interpret what that means.
Yeah, because if Clojure just sees a symbol like that, you can see that it thinks that you're referring to a Java class. That's why it's saying class not found exception. Whereas if I put the tick mark there, then I'm just going to get a vector with a symbol. I know we need to wrap this up. Just like really briefly want to point out for completeness, and this is like really for REPL usage interesting. If you're really just trying out a library, you can say refer all, and then you can, any function in there you can call without a prefix. Not recommended in your actual code because you will confuse yourself. But when you're trying stuff out in the REPL, it's actually totally valid. The other thing is, if you are requiring stuff like this, but like maybe it's a namespace that you're writing and that's changing, or for any other reason you want to like make sure that Clojure like reparses and reinterprets that whole thing, you can add reload, because otherwise if this has already been loaded, Clojure isn't going to do anything. It's just gonna maybe set up an alias, but it's not going to actually load the thing again. So that's two little things to be aware of.
Yeah. I want to mention one. I know we got to move on. But I want to mention one other thing too, because like Arna, I know you run a consulting company, right? And so like, I just wanted to mention Arna's remote REPLing services are for hire. If you need to just throw some speak some code at him and have him run it in a REPL, and he'll do that for money. So anyway,
true. For food too.
Yeah.
I'd love to describe more on this, but Anna, just before leaving, can you say doc require?
Doc require.
Yeah.
See how
Oh,
good he
this
is at this?
like this here.
You
And
don't
I
need
guess
to quote it.
and
It's,
do you need to quote it or not?
you do not.
You
Yeah.
do not, right? Yeah, it's a macro.
Wait, is that Control Q? Is that what's binded to Control Q?
But this describes everything that require will do. And at the bottom, you'll even see that those options of refer all or reload. And there's also reload all, which means all of the dependencies come in. You know, I do find this occasionally useful myself, but it's always useful to remember the doc macro when you're at the REPL. I find it's extremely useful to remember.
Yeah. Maybe one thing though, because a lot of these Clojure docs are a little bit cryptic. They sort of have their own writing style and vocabulary. And here in particular, something to be aware of is that they talk a lot about libs, which in this context really just means namespaces.
Well, I got learned. I love these sessions because I learn, like, I feel like I learned just as much as the people watching it. I guess that's the point is, you know, it's approachable, accessible, but seriously, that's great. And also that refer all little, I guess I knew, but I'd never thought to do that.
It doesn't work in ClojureScript though, which is very annoying.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's the difference
thanks.
between the two. Yeah.
Oh, so you teased me. Yes, what I'm hearing.
But that's a very good caveat. So yeah, I'm more like, I mean, I use ClojureScript just as much, but I guess I'm always more of a like Clojure first developer. So yeah, you're right. That does not work and that's also why. So
lies.
I tend to, like for Clojure test, if it's like, you know, just a Clojure namespace, I will say Clojure test refer all. Like that's one of the few places where I think it's entirely okay to do that.
Yes.
But if it's like Clojure script code or CLJC code, you need to, you know, list all the symbols that you're using. And then I usually just put like pretty much all of them. So I don't like need to like, you know, put some later on.
I will sometimes do a refer all if I'm testing a namespace because it's a test, not production code. And I'm testing every function in that namespace.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay,
Good.
I'm going to wrap it up now. Anyway, we've at least looked at another question before we leave. Our second question comes from Martinsladecek. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Is Martin here today?
I don't see
I don't
any
think
Martin
so.
in the audience, unfortunately. But it was a very good question, or it is a very good question.
We only have like 12 minutes left. Do we want to
I
try
know,
and
but
push
it's
it?
a namespace question, and we've been working on our namespaces.
Yeah, you're right.
Useful
You're right.
to go into it. So Martin's question was, I'm looking for some perspective on how to use namespaced keywords. Should they always correspond with real Clojure namespaces? The prevalence of the : syntax in official Clojure docs makes me think so, but many libraries don't follow this. Should I always use a global namespace identifier, such as : customer/ID or : com.myorganization.customer/ID? When putting my data on the wire to talk to a non-Clojure system, mostly with JSON payload, should I drop the namespace part or encode it in the string version of the key? I haven't yet had the opportunity to use Clojure as part of a larger production system or in an environment where it must communicate with non-Clojure services. So I've never been bitten by misguided use of namespaced keywords. What are your thoughts on this? So I'm going to kick this off by asking Daniel what his thoughts on this are.
This is a great question. It's my first thought. My second thought is like, yeah, it's I might be in the namespace keys everywhere phase of my career. I definitely like more often than not, I prefer to use namespace keys. And the reason is like to use them is just the same reason why we use namespaces at all. It's like to avoid these naming collisions. And so there's so many different contexts in which that can happen like without you anticipating it. I was just talking to a colleague recently about two different teams working on reframe app. And so like reframe, if you're not familiar with it, it keeps the whole state of your application, what's called the global state atom, which is generally a map. And so two different teams were modifying this map, and they picked the same keyword for like the top. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, they picked the same keyword, but like and ran into issues, and it took them a while to figure out like actually what was actually happening there, right? And so also for myself, as I write libraries, I intend for other people to use, and those libraries, you have maps, you have whether it's for configuration options or how you're trying to store actually the data that's like relevant to the library, whatever it is that you're building. Namespace keys, again, they keep you from painting yourself into a corner. They make it so that the code that you're writing is more easily extensible. So that is like my general approach to it. And I would say that there are some places where I feel like I feel comfortable not using namespace keys. And so, for example, one of those is like, let's say at one, like if you have a multi-level map, and at the top level you have a namespace key. Within that you have like a set of keys, a set of keys for the map below that. That's just like, okay, these are the like, this is the shape of the map. Like I feel like that inner map, it can be okay to use non-namespace keys within that under some circumstances. I think those are the main guidelines that I have for namespaces versus unnamespace. I know he had a lot of nuance there though to his questions, like should they correspond to actual namespaces?
Yeah.
And yeah, so there's plenty more to chew on here. Who wants to chew on it next?
I would love to, because that actually so should they correspond to actual namespaces? They should not necessarily. So I think something that to realize is that keywords, like even though that namespace part, like we call it the namespace of the keyword, but like intrinsically there's nothing that links that keyword to that namespace. Like it's just a name. It can exist anywhere in your code. And sometimes you want to avoid actually, like for instance, yeah, like Clojure makes it very easy to say, okay, I want the namespace keyword. Okay, I'm just going to colon, like, and then it's automatically namespaced and I don't have to think about it. But then if that code happens to move, you move that function somewhere else. Now that namespace, that keyword changes, and that might be what you intended, or that might be not what you intended. So I use, like in some projects, I'll deliberately use different prefixes for my keywords versus for my namespaces, sort of make it clear that, so for instance, like I have this fatsci project under Lambda Island, the namespaces are lambda island.fatsci.something. Most of the keywords that I'm using are like fatsci.something without the lambda island. So there's sort of a deliberate divide between the two. Now, sometimes I will use namespaces that like are, correspond to the namespace. For instance, say you have like a namespace, like there's a function which adds something to a map, which then travels through the rest of the system. The rest of the system doesn't care too much about it, but at some point that comes back to a function in that namespace, and you wanna get that data back, right? Like it's almost like private data, but it travels through the rest of the system. And then these like colon keywords are great, because like this like really ties it to that namespace. When you look at the data, you can see that's where it comes from. If that namespace, if you rename that namespace, that's fine. It still recognizes its own stuff. Or what, like Daniel's example of a reframe database, yeah, like different parts of your code are putting stuff in there. It's actually valuable to be able to see, okay, this is coming from that namespace. So it's a trade-off, and like they're definitely useful to sometimes tie them to a namespace. And then with like using actual namespaces means that you can also lean into the aliases, which we showed, like with, like for instance, the s, as URI, as str, then you can say : URI / to get a keyword with that namespace. And recent versions of Clojure have leaned into that to be able to say that you can define an alias without loading the library, which was an issue in the past, that like if you wanted to use the shorthand alias, you had to also load the library, which wasn't always what you wanted or could because of circular dependencies. So
or it may not exist.
Or it may not exist. Good point. Yeah. So so yeah, that's the main thing where my strong opinions lie. Like they can correspond to namespaces. It can be super useful if they do, but they don't necessarily always have to, and sometimes it's better if they don't.
I kind of like that. I had never thought of it that way, Arne, that like you inherently kind of bake in flexibility if you don't marry it to the namespace, because like it's so hard to know what your code base is going to look like and what free factors you're going to have to do and what you're going to have to move it. But if you keep, if you namespace it by concept, by mental concept, then you're not tying it to the namespace, which is a flexibility that's very, very nice to afford. And speaking to Daniel said, yeah, I think as I've evolved as a developer, like I used to be like namespace keywords, what? I didn't like them because my jump to source didn't work on them, and that would really irritate me. And so I hated I hated using namespace keywords. But at the time, I was working where I had one reframe repo to worry about. That's what I had to worry about. And it didn't, at that point, it didn't really, it wasn't that important as long as my stuff worked, whatever. But once that got married to another repo, and then like, I think your opinion on the necessity of namespace keywords definitely grows with the amount of projects that you juggle at once, because once you start juggling multiple projects with multiple namespaces with multiple different concepts enclosed in them, like, oh, which kit am I using, the Clojure kit or the Clojure script kit, like which things like that, it becomes a lot more important to like be able to keep track of all of your leave breadcrumbs for yourself that you can mentally grep instead of just relying on your jump to source. So yeah, that's my that's my bit there, that I agree with all of y'all. And it's really interesting. I had never thought about not tying it to the namespace, but I think that's a really great way to experiment too. If you want to start building your projects with namespace keywords, don't tie them to the namespaces, tie them to the concept. And then you kind of have the freedom to yeah.
Well, I'm going to try to.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, it sounds like Arna's advice could be generalized to like use semantic namespaces. It just happens that sometimes like the actual semantic that you want is like you want the namespace to correspond to one of your code namespaces, right? So like in general, like your code namespaces are for code organization, and sometimes semantically you want that to be like coded in your namespace keyword. Right.
I would put it as expect your data to outlive your code. Like if you're using namespace keywords, they should make sense even in the absence of the code.
I like that.
Sergey Zernov has made a comment. It seems like : notation won't play well with data that is stored long-term in a database. And I would agree with this.
I saw Mitesh has his hand up too.
We are nearly at time.
Yep. So there's one interesting bit in this question, right, which is converting it to JSON format. So if the client is not in Clojure script and you're not using transit, how do we deal with this? Because I've faced this issue.
So this is where I was going to jump in and make the comment. So I started not using namespace keywords because I started around 2010. I didn't see them very much at that point. Since then, probably the place where I don't use namespace keywords are when code is isolated within a function or across just a couple of functions in the same namespace, and we're not going to see those structures escape. And also I'll do it a lot when I'm working with JSON, because with interop, other applications are not expecting to find slashes in their keys. So, I mean, it is possible to say, you know, ns/name as a key in Java, sorry, in JSON, and that will get turned into something namespaced if we ask to turn our keys into keywords. But it's generally not doing, it's not working with general JSON consumers or producers. So typically in a JSON world, I wouldn't expect namespaces on my keywords. I personally first started encountering namespaces being actively used on keywords when Datomic came out, because Datomic schemas were using them, and we had the DB namespace, and then we had, you know, various sub namespaces dot separated being used within Datomic. And then of course once spec occurred, we saw it used in much more liberally, like everywhere, and it was compulsory. So but this brings us to the end of today. I appreciate the contributions from the audience today. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this with us. I'd like to get closing comments or advice from each of our Clouncillors. I had to remember the word for the moment. I mean, we're all clowns here, but but for each of the Clouncillors, I'm going to start with Arne.
Are these our picks?
Yeah, your
Okay.
tips, your advice, whatever. And Arne, is, my advice to Arne is to not be on mute.
Yes. Well, my advice to you in this season that's warming up would be use sunscreen and drink enough water. My pick, did I already pick Unwell? I shared Unwell with Jordan.
No,
were you going to pick Unwell?
No,
okay.
Okay. Stop.
Okay, sorry.
Stop.
I'm not
That's
picking,
my pick.
I did not mention Unwell. Yes, use sunscreen. Please carry on.
I guess I'll go next, since you have a pattern. We need to have an intervention about you choosing people's picks.
Yeah, we need to check this off beforehand.
So I am a I'm a listener. I have got to listen to things and so I was listening to a lot of like true crime podcasts and then getting a lot of anxiety because I live alone and I was listening to all these horrible stories. But I like crime because it's like, ooh, who done it? Like I like just like the Ellery Queen kind of like mystery, just like errant in the background. And so I asked for podcast or audio, whatever recommendations on Twitter, and Arna had said like, I don't know if you're into audio dramas. And I didn't know what that was, but I'm like, oh, you mean a radio show? Yes, of course. I love those. Cause like Hitchhiker's Guide, like original, which they're remastering. That's actually next. They just remastered apparently. And that's next up on my list. But yeah, he recommended this audio drama. It's called Unwell and Midwestern Gothic Mystery. And it's kind of, if you're not familiar with the concept of an audio drama, it's almost like it's audio engineers really just leaning into it and having a good time. It's like the audio track from a movie. If you could listen to that and just know what's going on, you know, they have the steps, the door opened, you know, each character's like voice. And it's just really also the people that put it on are really conscious just about everything they do. You know, it's so good. Actually, I got up to season 4, like I'm now, it comes out every week and I'm like joined in, but yeah, Unwell.
So you're at the season break, the frustrating season break.
No. I went past the season break. They're releasing it live again. And I'm like halfway through season 4.
Oh yeah, but season 4's break just happened. Like
no.
Okay, I'm going to cut you two off now.
Okay.
I know. We're the worst. We're not no negative self-talk. We talk a lot.
Welcome to the second hour of the Clouncil, where we just talk about Unwell. Yeah, well, okay. My advice is don't wear these glasses for an hour. I have a headache.
Oh no.
That is good advice. I'm going to stick with that.
Yeah. Paula, how about you?
Me, well, the biggest advice I have is to wear sunscreen, which Arne took. I've been wearing it while playing tennis lately, and it makes a difference. And then I went for a walk without sunscreen the other day, and whoa, did it knock me out. I didn't even burn significantly, but it just exhausts you getting that much intense sun exposure suddenly like that. But the other thing is, the other advice I would have is to consider that graph databases and entity graph databases are not necessarily the same thing, and that they do have different performance characteristics, and they make you think about your data just a little bit differently. And on that note,
Can you give an example of each?
Sorry?
Can you give an example of each?
For an entity graph database, there's Neo4j, there's Datomic. For a graph database, there is any RDF store or Asami, which is like, I'm living in an RDF world at the moment, so this is a thing which keeps coming up for me. But
really
graphs make you think about your data differently. They are not necessarily something that you should put all your data into. Relational databases have definite strengths and are, they're ubiquitous throughout the industry for a good reason. But there are also very good reasons to use graph databases as well, and they're worth considering just to understand, what is going to work best with your data. And you can, in fact, use a combination of the two. On this note, I'm going to call the meeting to order, and not to order. I'm going to call close for the meeting.
The disorder.
And,
you're going to be so.
You're going to be everybody.
Please, you're going to be so mad at me. I'm sorry. But hey, use natural sunscreen if you can, instead of the chemical stuff, because it kills our coral reefs. Okay, bye. Keep going.
I'm looking forward to seeing everybody in a couple of weeks. And then I believe the week after that, we may be seeing some people live at Clojure D. For those who are traveling, please wear face masks. I will be hoping as many people around me as possible will be wearing face masks. I do not want to have a virus when I'm at Clojure D. I hope not to get one at Clojure D either. But looking forward to seeing people in a couple of weeks and seeing hopefully people live in Berlin.
Hey.
Okay.